In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion on vessels. Now we're going to review some things that we spoke about last time, and then we're going to add a little bit extra at the end. So just to review, when we talk about vessels, we've covered the main vessels of the heart already. We talk about blood vessels, we're talking about three main types: arteries, capillaries, and veins. If we break it up a bit further, we can say that we have arteries that are the largest vessels leaving the heart. Then if we go a bit further, those go into arterioles, and then capillaries, which are very small. That's where gas exchange occurs with the cells of the body. Then we start bringing blood back to the heart. That's deoxygenated and has had most of its nutrients removed at this stage. And so now we start bringing the blood back through the vessels that are called venules, and then finally the veins, which are the largest vessels that are bringing blood back to the heart. Last time we also reviewed the general structure of the wall of a blood vessel. We compared an artery on the left to a vein on the right. And remember, the three main layers that we have here are the tunica intima, tunica media, and the tunica externa. And we really noted here that the tunica media is much larger in arteries, so much thicker in arteries than it is in veins. And this helps to give arteries the resistance that they need to withstand the blood pressure that is being exerted by the left ventricle as the blood leaves the heart. Also, you'll notice that thicker vessels, whether they be veins or arteries, have a vasa vasorum, or their own blood supply, in their external layer, the tunica externa, or the adventitia. Remember, if you're looking at a histological sample and telling the difference between an artery and a vein, I know they're labeled here, but there's two reasons you know that the one on the upper left is an artery and the one on the bottom right is a vein. The first is that the lumen of the artery is much smaller in diameter than the lumen of the vein. The second is that the tunica media of the artery is much thicker than the tunica media of the vein. So now let's add to this a little bit. So how do venules and veins differ from arteries? Well, we have our venous vessels on the left here, and then we have our larger veins on the right. The venous vessels are conducting blood from the capillaries back towards the heart. Or the blood pressure is much lower in these venous vessels than in arteries. These venous vessels, or these venules, are very small, and then eventually these venules join to form veins. If we look at the right here, we'll see that the lumen of the veins are much bigger than that of an artery. Over half your blood in your body at any given time is in the veins, which makes sense. Also, you'll see that the veins are under very low pressure. So this is sort of a problem that we're going to talk about later on, about a slide or two. And we'll talk about how this problem is resolved. Okay, if we wanted a nice little chart here at the end to compare the relative thickness of the different sections of the vessel walls, comparing different types of arteries to veins and venules. It's a nice little chart here that shows you the differences that we've been talking about. So by no means do you have to memorize this chart, so I didn't scare anyone. but I do want you to just sort of look it over and just see the differences that we're talking about. And this is actual empirical data showing you that these differences in the thickness of the different walls of these different vessels is a real observation. Okay, so what are the mechanisms that counteract the low venous pressure? I mentioned a couple slides ago that veins are under very low pressure. And so the question here becomes, well, how does that blood that's coming through the veins back to the heart get back to the heart to counteract the flow of gravity and this low pressure? So think of blood from your feet and your lower limbs, going in the superior direction, coming back to the heart. How does that happen if there's no pressure to help that situation? And really it relies upon two things. So the first is that your skeletal muscles, as they contract, actually massage the blood in the veins back up in the superior direction towards your heart. Now, if they were just pushing the blood up and there was no way to prevent the blood from falling back down, it would just fall back down again. But the second part to this situation, so first was skeletal muscle, right? The second is this, that the venous system has lots of valves. And so what happens is, as the blood is being pushed up this way, what's happening is that the valves are basically one-way valves, and so the blood can go up, but it can't go back down again. So when you combine the first thing, the skeletal muscle contraction, with the second thing, the valves in the veins, you can see how blood can work its way back up to the heart, even though the veins are under very low pressure. The final thing we want to talk about is something here called a vascular anastomoses. And what these are is things we've sort of talked about before a little bit, but basically where you have all these different meetings of capillaries that eventually turn to venules, so this sort of intersection here. And really what we see is that when we're looking at this, especially on the arterial end, we have all these precapillary sphincters here, right, that are shunting blood in certain directions as the body needs them in those areas. So it's sort of a neat little diagram. We saw this one before in the previous lecture, but I just want to add this term with this. You associate that term with this array or this network. Okay, and that's it for our second lecture on vessels. Just sort of a short review on stuff we talked about before, and then wanted to add that little discussion about the low pressure in the veins and how blood actually works its way back up to the heart despite that low pressure. Remember, before proceeding to the next lecture, you want to make sure you know these learning outcomes and that you can execute them before you move on.